Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 77. Are you a beginner or intermediate Python programmer who's made it through some of the fundamentals? Have you tried to tackle a big project but got stuck and frustrated? Completing some small projects might be the answer. This week on the show, we have author Al Sweigart to talk about his new book, The Big Book of Small Python Projects. We discuss the advantages of sometimes thinking small in terms of Python programs. We talk about completing projects and the benefits of manually copying code by typing it in yourself. Al also has suggestions about tools for beginners and intermediate developers. This episode is sponsored by Rev AI, the most trusted way to build global speech-to-text to insights, products, and workflows. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Al, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it's great to be back on here again.
Yeah, you've been busy. You've been making books all throughout this wonderful time.
Yeah,
it's been pretty cool.
That's what I would like people to think. Yes, I've been very busy and productive and not just sort of staring at the wall during the pandemic.
Well, it seems that way from the outside. Definitely. I really like the format for your new book, the Big Book of Small Python Projects. So I have a bunch of questions about that generally, but I thought maybe we could start off talking about you were on a panel with a bunch of other Python authors at PyCascades, and I thought I could include a link for that. I think it's really interesting, kind of some of the stuff you guys got into there about. It was basically everything, a very lofty title, everything you need to know about writing technical Python books.
Yeah, I saw that title. And I was like, I think we're going to need more than 45 minutes.
Yeah. So what were the kinds of things you covered in the talk?
Mostly that it was, of course, a lot more work than I realized. And just talking about the general process that I have, which isn't too much of a surprise. I usually just start with considering the audience of who this book is for, because I don't want to write something that other people have already written about. And
yeah,
I start with an outline, and I mostly just try to get the table of contents set. And then I just sort of fill in the skeleton from there, where I just make notes of like, hey, I sort of want to have a paragraph about this and a paragraph about this. And I'll have a random text file of scratch text that I've written that I'm not going to include in the book, but also I really have trouble letting it go. So I take it out of the book and I put it into the scratch file where nobody will ever see it, but it's not the same as just editing out. It's sort of like checking in commented out code.
Okay.
I know it's probably a bad habit, but I kind of do it anyway. And then I also have other text files of just sort of whenever I think of a thing that needs to go back into an earlier chapter, but probably affects a lot of other bits of the book. I mean, it always, I'm always astounded when I get done with a book project and it's just a book that you can read from front to back. And that was very much not the process of creating that book.
Yeah, sounds like it. That's interesting. I approach making video courses in kind of a similar way with definitely the table of contents part, but I always come back and create an introduction really after all of it, because it really makes more sense to teach people like, this is really what we're going to cover, and this is what what's important, and then kind of the same thing with like a summary at the very, very tail.
Yeah, I always do the introduction chapter last, because I start off writing the book about what I think it's going to be about, and then I finally realize what the book is going to be about, and that's when I need to write the introduction.
I find it interesting that I think of it almost as like you're commenting your writing, like
Yes.
you'd comment your code. That technique sounds interesting. That it can help you maybe remind yourself of previous versions, but also like where is this supposed to go? Kind of, is that kind of the idea? Or
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's a code smell. It's sort of a bad habit to comment out code and then check that commented out code into source control, because it's this code isn't running because it's commented out. So why are you making a record of it, as opposed to just commenting out code temporarily just to debug things or try things out. But yeah, it's sort of in that in between space of, I need to get rid of this because I don't need it, but I also kind of want to hang on to it anyway, just in case. So for like 200 pages of book, I'll usually have about 50 to 100 pages of scratch notes that I just wanted to put in, but it just really I didn't have a place to fit it.
Do you have a favorite tool you write in?
Everybody is always astounded when I say this. To write books, I use Microsoft Word.
I don't see anything wrong with that. That's totally fine. That's what it's designed for.
There was a time when I first started out where I thought, like, okay, I need to learn LaTeX or LaTeX or however it's pronounced. And then just trying to figure out how to do basic things like, hey, I want to have this image in the center of the page horizontally, but not vertically. And 45 minutes later, I'll finally sort of figure out how that works. And then I want to add page. And it just got to be a huge headache. And when I started working with No Starch Press, they just provide a MS Word template to use. And wow, yeah, that it works. They'll later take it and then pour it. That's just used for the editing. They'll pour that text into think like Adobe InDesign or some other desktop publishing tool.
Yeah, layout thing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, for proper layout.
When you started out programming, I know we talked a little bit about this in our previous episode. What I'm wondering about, though, kind of to rehash it maybe a little bit, is were you like a projects type of person? Were you taking other people's code, like out of a magazine or a book, and typing them in when you were learning to code?
Yeah, that's exactly how I learned. There was a friend of mine in elementary school found a book in the library about basic programming. And so I basically had that book and then the reference manual that came with the Compaq 386 computer.
Okay.
That, was technically, it's a reference manual for basic. So it has all the information in there. And I would read through that book and just not understand any of it whatsoever, because they would just throw all this jargon at you. And I was just like, well, I want to make Mario. How do I make Mario?
Right.
But the other book sort of just mostly taught through examples. It had the source code for a bunch of little games like tic-tac-toe. Actually, tic-tac-toe was the most complicated game at the very end of the book, and I could never get it working correctly. But really simple, like guess the number, text-based games. And I could actually understand that. And just from playing around with the source code, I could see I noticed all the patterns between the different games. And, I really hate telling the story of how I learned to code, because I'm one of those kids that fortunately grew up with a PC in the house.
Right.
And it sort of makes people think, oh, in order to program, you have to have started when you were, 2 years old or something like that. But really, like all the quote unquote games that I made for probably about the next 8 years of my life were variations of those guess the number games. There really wasn't that much to game design, I guess. It wasn't really a thing so much as it is now.
Yeah. I experienced that too. I know what you're saying, that there were some tools that were out there, game maker kind of things, but in general, I was creating really simple text kind of games. I had a Atom computer, which is like a thing that bolted onto the ColecoVision or whatever, and made it a computer. And that was really my first one where I could kind of hack on it. But it was, very simple ideas. At most, I could get like, individual like blocks of like,
right.
Not even like individual pixels moving around the screen. So it was very, very basic.
Yeah, I remember there was a thing called Click and Play.
Okay.
That apparently was very popular in the 90s. I remember it came with the PC that my parents got when I was in high school. And I looked at it and played around with it a bit and had no idea how to use it. So I I promptly put it away and never touched it again. And now, here, 20 years later, I'm reading about other people who are like, I remember Click and Play. I made so many games with this and it was so much fun. And it really opened my eyes. I thought like, oh,
Yeah.
wow, well, I missed out on that, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I do want to focus on maybe a little bit later. I had a conversation with Marlene Mongami about the lack of resources for a lot of people, just even to get to a computer, or maybe what they have is like a phone or some other kinds of things. And I think it's neat how in your book you have ways to kind of access that code for people who maybe don't have an actual sit down at a desk computer sort of situation. I guess we could talk about it right now, but I think that was that important to you to include those kinds of other methodologies so people don't feel like excluded?
Oh yeah, that was a big part of all the projects that I have in this book. So starting from the beginning, the book is the big book of small Python projects, and it's for sort of beginner intermediate programmers,
right,
who maybe they've gone through a Hello World tutorial with Python, but they don't really know how to sit down and write a program. And so this book doesn't really have a lot of prose that teaches people how to program and explain concepts. Instead, it's just basically just the source code for 81 different games and simulations and little animation programs. But they're also most of them are text-based, just using print and input, essentially. There are a few games that have colorful text, but I'm basically just sticking with ASCII art. And I was sort of worried that I was dating myself when I did this, because I mean I've talked to other programmers and who give me the line of like, well, what they should be teaching the kids these days to get them into programming is exactly the same things I did as a kid when I learned how to program. And so I was really worried about that, but I also had the realization that the text-based medium was really great for keeping these programs simple, because you could, since the source code is in text and the output of the program is in text, so you could always take some part of the output of the program and then trace it back to the print call
right,
that actually produced it. And so you can it's a lot easier to develop that cause-effect relationship between what code you write and what the code does. And so I started writing down a whole bunch of other, what would be good small projects for people to learn, because, once people have gone through those Hello World tutorials and they want to move on to some more intermediate content or learning materials, it becomes really hard to figure that out. And sometimes people will tell them like, oh, you can just take a look at open source projects. But if you've just gone through Hello World, you don't want to start looking through the Linux kernel source code as for like, oh, this is how real programs work, because that's so hard. But even other smaller open source projects, these are written by professional software engineers mostly. They might not have good documentation, or they might not even have any onboarding materials for new contributors, and so that's a huge wall that you suddenly come to. So I wanted to think of like, well, what if we had very small projects that were simple? There's no additional libraries that you have to install. And so I started writing up a list of sort of the design features that I wanted to follow, or the design rules for all these projects. And so they are keeping them small. I chose 256 lines of code as my arbitrary limit, just because it's a power of 2. And
nice.
yeah, I was thinking like, how can I explain the significance of 256? It's like, well, it's 2 to the 8, and that's the number of integers you can represent with a single byte. And I realized I was like going off on a tangent, so I just call it powers of 2 are lucky programmer numbers. So,
there you go. Totally.
Yeah, so I wanted them to be small. I also wanted them to be text-based, so that you don't have to install or worry about graphics and mouse input and screen resolution. And also being text-based, it really lowers the expectations, I guess, of these programs, because they're just small games that are supposed to be amusing for about 5 minutes. And I think Minecraft did this beautifully with its retro pixel art style, where just by making the graphics look simpler as the aesthetic, it really eased the burden on for the developer, because the creator of Minecraft was just a single person when he started out. And so, he didn't have a lot of time to make incredible art for his game. So he just started off with just blocky looking graphics, and it just became a style in its own right.
Yeah, totally.
So I decided you just stick with text and then maybe some ASCII art that you can, using the dashes and underline characters as lines, and or the back and forward slashes as diagonal lines. You can start drawing pictures with just text characters placed around there. So it would be enough to convey sort of like a playing card or very simple graphics that way. So small and text-based with no additional modules that you need to install. I have a list of a few modules that some of the games require, such as Paperclip to just add copy and paste features to the program. But for the most part, you can just use the Python standard library for all of this.
And that allows it to really be universal. Like, you have eliminated all these, like you said, the complexity of additional packages and the platforms that they would have to run on. It's like, if you can run Python, you can basically run any of these small programs, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of the programs will have like a level file that they'll read from, but for the most part, they only use standard I/O for the text input and output. So you can run most of these programs on Python Anywhere or these browser-based Python interpreters. So you don't even need to have Python installed on your computer then to actually have it run, play around with. And then another great thing about not having additional libraries that you need to install is that the code is a lot more portable. So if this book does well, I could do a big book of small JavaScript programs or small Java programs or small C# programs, and the code translates fairly well. So that was also something that I had in mind when I started writing this book as well.
Yeah, I can see that. And like you're saying, that generally it's going to be a single file that the thing's going to run on, but like there are a couple of exceptions there where it might be a couple. One of the things that you were saying before that was the idea of like learning and going and looking at some large project out there, like a Flask or a Django or some other, something somebody says, oh, you should just go look at source code. Is this going to be multiple files that reference each other and you don't even know how they tie together? And so that this is definitely going to, you can kind of hold it, maybe almost all of it in your head, depending on, how good your memory is as far as active RAM.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a huge thing with programming too. And programmers are also sort of to blame for that, just because what software developers love doing is creating hierarchies of concepts or files.
Yeah.
And we think we're adding organization to our code, but really we're just adding a sort of bureaucracy to our code projects. But because, in our head, it makes sense, like, oh, well, this code should be in this file because it's related to this other thing. And then you've created this complicated system of folders and subfolders and subfolders with other files, when really you could have just thrown it all into one .py file.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, I've kept all of them in a single Python source file. And the other nice thing about that too is that it makes it a lot easier to share as well. One of the big problems with just passing code to someone else and getting it to run on their computer is that you have to do all the environment setup and everything else. But for all of these, you can just do a select all and then copy and then paste it into a forum or into an email, even, as long as it doesn't mangle the white space. But it's just a single file that they have to deal with, which, yeah, every time that you have something that the user or the reader needs to do, you're probably going to lose about half of your audience for each step. And so, if they have to install some graphics library, half of your readers aren't going to be able to get that. And then they're just out of luck and they can't progress any further. And then I guess they become accountants or lawyers or something else besides software engineers.
Yeah.
And yeah.
That's an interesting way to look at it, the dividing your audience as you go. I have experienced that, though, like in trying to follow other online tutorials where you were hoping that it was going to be for, particular, like kind of a universal platform, like you're showing me this concept, but pretty soon you're like, okay, well, that guy had Linux or whoever wrote it had that particular flavor of stuff and didn't really think outside the box. And you're right, you stumble into it and you're like, I'm just trying to learn here. And I'm now having to research, all these different potential options or how it works on my machine, which is super frustrating.
Yeah, it's 1998 and I'm using click and play all over again. It's like,
yeah.
Oh, well, this looks really cool, but I can't actually do anything with it. So I'm just not going to touch it ever again.
Rev AI, the most trusted way to build global speech-to-text to insights, products, and workflows. Trained on more than 50,000 hours of human-transcribed verbatim speech data covering a wide range of topics, Rev AI offers developers unparalleled speech recognition accuracy, with word error rates lower than similar solutions from major players like Amazon and Google. Your first 5 hours are on us. Try us out today at Rev AI. That's REV.ai. I like your instructions for the steps in the book. The idea of, obviously it's a book. Anybody can kind of approach it how they want, but you have a suggested methodology to kind of get people going. I don't know. I thought it was clever, and I like the steps, especially for a beginner, that they can kind of get an idea of what's happening. Is it okay? We just kind of go through them a little bit.
Yeah. The advice that I give to readers is to essentially just sort of, first of all, run the program, just, copy and paste it and then run it and see what it does so that you have an idea of what you're actually creating.
What was mine supposed to do when I'm done with it?
And then that way, they can also just play these games and have fun, and it sort of just builds up excitement. And also they can see like, oh, these are fairly simple programs. I'm not setting out to make Minecraft in a single weekend or anything like that.
Right.
And then after playing around with it, I tell them, okay, just erase everything and then just copy by hand the code out of the book, just typing it along. And I have no like major research to back me up, but for me anyway, just writing out the code I get used to it. I think it just slows me down enough that I have to pay attention to each line since I'm typing it out. If I'm just reading the code or if I'm just copying and pasting it, I very quickly just like glance over it and I don't actually know what I'm doing. And after you're done entering it yourself, just go ahead and run it. And then there's going to be errors. And so pay attention to sort of the error line, the error messages. I feel like that's another part of programming that really trips up beginners, is because I don't think any programmer ever really writes an error message thinking that a human being is going to read it one day. So, Python had like syntax error, invalid syntax for the longest time. And then in Python 3.10, they've started adding a lot more descriptive error messages, which
I'm excited by that. We've been talking a little bit on the show, the idea that there'd be like these little sort of symbols, like caret, kind of, going back to your ASCII art thing, actually pointing at like this is what's going on. That's potentially the problem, as opposed to very often it would be showing you, well, I got up to here, and then it failed. And so you're like maybe looking at the wrong place as to where the error might be happening. And it's nice. I'm liking this new stuff that they're adding.
Yeah, I think you talked about this in an episode, but where you would get a zero divide error, but it wouldn't show you before where exactly that zero divide was happening. So if the line has multiple divisions operations in it, you're sort of just, you have to guess as to like, oh, what was set to zero here?
Scratching your head. Yeah, the PEP is good, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but I'll definitely include a link for it, and it has the actual written examples, which is a nice thing about the PEPs too, being a documentation thing, that they're including more and more examples. At least in my opinion, I'm fairly new to the language, but as I'm reading more about it and seeing this kind of stuff added to the language, it's definitely making me feel more comfortable with it all the time, and it becoming an even better, teaching tool.
Yeah, that's something that I've really noticed with programming is, because these, improved error messages, that's not a new programming language feature or some new algorithm or something like that.
Right.
But it is incredibly important because I feel like Python's popularity is mostly because it's a programming language that has the gentlest learning curve possible for beginners. So it's not just computer science majors who can learn to program with it. It's really anybody who has a small interest in programming.
Yeah.
Yeah, the intimidation factor for programming has always been much larger of an issue than if how good you are at math or how old you are when you start to learn how to program. Yeah.
It always seems like people are sending you off to Hogwarts or something, and you're going to become like this magician. And when you come back, they're not going to understand anything that you're doing, It's like, no, actually.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of wild.
And on top of that, the magicians also don't really understand what they're doing half the time either.
That's true. Too funny.
But yeah, so, type in the code, fix the errors that come up, and then I also sort of say and then at the same time, just re-implement it on your own. You don't have to copy it exactly the way the program originally ran, so you're not memorizing code.
Yeah.
But you can make your own version of it, which is so much more realistic than just following along with the code in a tutorial or something like that. And hopefully I have sort of a range. Some of these programs are really simple and they're just sort of like 20 or 30 lines of code. And then some of them I actually do break that 256 line limit. But usually they'll just be around like 200 something lines of code. And that's small enough where, for beginner, that could be like a weekend project.
Yeah, totally.
Or something that they can work on.
Or an afternoon or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of these, there's 81 of these projects. So if you don't like one thing, you can probably just skip around. I have them listed in alphabetical order. I realize that's probably the easiest way just to have them. And then in the back, I have sort of an index. Each project has a set of tags with it. So some of them are like marked for beginners and some of them are games.
Okay.
Some of them are animations and some of them are like card games specifically, or puzzles or mazes or encryption programs or something like that.
Yeah, in your list of stuff, you mentioned beyond going through just using the error system to find typos or bugs and so forth of trying to run the code. You mentioned running it under a debugger, and I recently had Nina on to talk about debugging.
Mm-hmm.
Nina Zakharenko, and we talked about using it across your different projects. But I think this is a really nice time to introduce it, especially for somebody who's a beginner or intermediate person, to have a small program to debug, and walk through and see as the code is executing, but also to see, okay, what are the values of things as we're going along. And so I think this is actually a nice combination of things to implement as you're going along. And we were talking about it, that we feel like, the print statement has always been the thing that has always been thrown out there in so many of the tutorials of Python.
Yes.
But a debugger is like it's not that big of an additional step. It's not that, it's not like 5 times as difficult. It's just like another little step in your path of learning Python.
Yeah, I think Nina had a talk or something that was called Stop Printing, Start Debugging, something like that.
Yeah, it's Goodbye Print, Hello Debugger.
Oh, yes,
I think.
Yes, that is that is a much snappier title than the one I had.
It's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do talk about the debugger in the introduction chapter. I mean, looking back over it now, I wish I went into far more detail about how the debugger works. And even with my other books, I've come to realize that really we should be teaching the debugger a lot earlier than we do currently. Usually, like, debugging is sort of like one of those things like documentation that's sort of put in at the very back of the book. But I feel like probably right after you introduce flow control, like loops and if statements, that would probably be the best time to say, and now here's how the debugger works. Don't be scared of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Watch your stuff travel through those loops and structures. And yeah, I like that about that. That's
Yeah. It's one of those things that we, once you've been programming for years and years, you sort of forget that there was a time that you didn't know that. And the other thing that I covered is just being able to type.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that.
Yeah, and basic text editor features.
Yeah, you there's like three things I want to talk about now. I want to go back before we go into typing. You talk about, okay, modify it in ways that you think, you could make it your own.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Are there other suggestions that you have about how should people experiment with this code? I mean, obviously you're not trying to set guidelines or rules behind it, but are there suggestions that you're saying, hey, don't just leave this as it is. Like, this is your chance to kind of make it your own. Are there other suggestions you make for that?
Oh, yes. I totally forgot about that. Yeah. And so also, finally after you've typed it in and you've created your own, I just sort of encourage experimentation. There are some places in some of these projects where I'll have a comment with a little exclamation point, and I'll just say like, hey, try changing this to some other value, or try commenting out the following lines of code and see how the behavior changes. And that's just to help build up that sort of cause and effect between what you've written and what happens. So each project also has like a small list of possible changes that you can make. And then also there's a section called Exploring the Program where I'll make suggestions for changes you can make. And some of these suggestions will purposefully just crash the program, but they will crash the program in an interesting way. Or just add like a really silly like infinite loop or some like silly behavior from the program that is not correct, but it is kind of fun to play with. And that's a lot of that is also just to get rid of that intimidation factor of like, oh no, my program crashed.
Yeah, this can happen. And don't be upset. Errors are your friends. They're trying to tell you things.
Yeah, there's no way you can damage your computer by having your program crash. I mean, crash sounds kind of scary, actually, but really it just means the operating system decided to stop your program because it got an instruction it doesn't know how to do.
I had these Atari computers back in the day. It was the Atari ST series, and instead of like giving like a blue screen or whatever, it would show a bomb when you crashed your computer, and you could know like how like intense the crash was by the number of bombs.
That is terrifying.
Like, I know. It was like, oh, that was a 4-bomb crash there. It was pretty crazy.
Oh man.
So yeah, I don't know if that's a great icon for that, but I always found that fascinating.
Yeah, so. Yeah. There's it's something that I have to keep in mind. I think when I started creating programs for Scratch, which is the tool for the programming environment from MIT for programming for kids, usually ages like 8 to 12. I think they recommend 8 to 16, but usually I see like 8 to 12 or 14 is the ages that I see. And they made a lot of great design choices for that. And I also realized, because the website where you publish your programs is mostly for kids, I started realizing like, even having like mocking messages from a game, like when you lose, like it would say like, haha, you lose, loser, or something like that. I sort of realized like, or even some kids would point out, it's like, hey, the game doesn't have to make fun of you just because you lost it. It's actually fine to lose at a video game. It's and then I started thinking like, oh yeah, why there is sort of you build up this idea of like, right, I'm not just making programs for myself or some buddies.
Right.
You have to sort of think like, oh, what does this look like to somebody who is not like you? Somebody who, maybe English isn't their first language, or they're a different age, like much, much younger or much, much older than you, or just, have some different cultural context.
Yeah, it doesn't translate always, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay. I going to your typing thing, I went to that first website you suggested, and I don't have it written down.
Oh, yeah.
But I was like, wow, that's a really great online resource.
Yeah.
I was impressed.
I was actually for a while thinking about making my own typing tutor program. And so I started doing a lot of research online, and I realized how much better they are today. Because I also downloaded some older programs, and I think these were sort of like the older ones were sort of typing tutors made by programmers who didn't do any actual sort of pedagogical research or anything like that. They would just be like,
sure.
oh, these space aliens with a word are appearing, and type the word to shoot them in.
Right.
But like a lot of good typing programs, I think this like typingclub.com and typing.com. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the one I was checking out. Yeah, typingclub.com, and had like, I didn't run the first evaluation thing where it sort of looks at your level. I haven't done that yet, but I'm probably going to this afternoon.
Yeah, it's
because I thought it was interesting.
I mean, it's really nice because they'll have like a picture of the keyboard with transparent hands on it. So that way, and they'll reiterate that the main rule that you should always follow when learning how to type is don't look at your own hands.
Yeah.
And so if you need to know where a key is, you can look on the screen and find it. I thought like, once somebody shows you that, you realize like, wow, that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Why don't all typing programs have that sort of thing? And it is important because, you don't need to be a fast typist to be a programmer.
Sure.
But it's one of those things where it's a minor frustration that you can get past when you have to like type out a bunch of code and then you realize you've mistyped it, so you have to go back and change it around. So, just getting beyond the hunt and peck stage of typing is really helpful. And so this is also something that Scratch was able to sidestep completely with their sort of snap together code blocks.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because I realized this when I started teaching kids for a Saturday morning programming class that, kids, if you're 9 or 10 years old, you don't necessarily know how to type. And if anything, you're just used to smartphones and tablets where you're tapping.
And they autocomplete.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so not having that in Scratch was really great. But now if you're moving on to Python, this is sort of when you should learn how to type, not properly with fingers on the home row at all times, but just be able to type moderately well, and you'll avoid a lot of, slowdowns, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were like 600 something lessons I saw. It was like crazy. It really goes on. I was wondering if I'd seen some other language typing tutor programs or whatever that were kind of geared for programmers where they really threw your hands into the curly braces and other kinds of things. And I'm wondering if that could be like the side module they could add to something like that.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, obviously wouldn't be something they'd have initially, but I should suggest it because I think that would be good. I mean, not, Python has its own set of those, but it would be good if you got your hands comfortable with, finding those kinds of things, the hash mark and all those kinds of, fundamental, symbols you use all the time.
Right. There's a Unix command line program call TypeSpeed.
Oh, that's the one, I think.
That was basically one of these older typing programs, but it mostly one of the word sets you can have is like Unix commands.
Okay.
And so it's the letter frequency is much different from typing regular English, and you also get used to just typing weird characters and ioctl or or just words that you normally don't type there. So that's also another thing.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. I feel like it's really connected to this week's topic. The course is designed to help you take your skills to the next level by building projects. It's titled Grow Your Python Portfolio with 13 Intermediate Project Ideas. The course is based on a Real Python article by Habib Shobaju, and in the course, Darren Jones takes you through the importance of building projects, the major platforms you can build projects for. It includes details for command line, web, and graphical user interfaces, and has 13 different project ideas that you can work on, along with multiple tips for working on those projects. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to create projects that you can share with others and demonstrate your knowledge. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections and include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So you had a few suggestions in your introduction also about IDEs, and you kind of centered initially on the Mu editor. I'm thinking that's how it's pronounced.
Yes.
And why do you like that one?
So originally, I really liked idle, which is the IDE that comes with Python, because it's simple.
Yeah.
It's really simple. It's just sort of a bare bones editor. And I think having an editor bundled with Python is a phenomenal idea, because then you don't have to have people learning how to use text editors and then learning how to use the command line so that they could run Python with their file or something. It's a lot easier. But I did have some ideas for how idle could be improved, and I wrote up a bunch of them. And then the creators of Mu sort of implemented a lot of those same ideas. Turns out I found out about Mu from a PyCon video, and sort of things like tabs for each of the files, and a separate pane that's still attached. Well, a pane that is attached to the main window that shows the output.
Yeah.
Currently, idle has the file editor window and then the interactive shell window, but they're separate windows. And a really common thing that beginners send me emails about is they don't know how to run their code because they're either entering code into the file editor when they wanted to put it into the interactive shell, or vice versa. And the only thing that I can really say, because they look so similar to each other, is like, well, the interactive shell has the 3 angle brackets for the prompt.
Yeah.
I just look for that. But yeah, at the same time, though, there are people who are comfortable enough just moving into something like Visual Studio Code,
like PyCharm or something.
PyCharm, the community edition for that. And I tell people, like, these are great. Don't worry too much about the really complicated looking interface that it has. 80% of those features you're not even going to use your first year, basically.
Yeah.
And those are nice too, because they also have the debugger built in with them.
Yep. Yeah, which is very powerful. That's nice.
And just on top of typing, I also go into how do you edit text, because I realized there's a lot of things I do just sort of like hitting Control A, well, like knowing the keyboard shortcuts, like for copy and paste and select all.
Yeah.
Or holding down Shift and then pressing End so that you highlight the rest of the line.
Yeah, those are so powerful.
Yeah. And they're all sort of things I just do naturally at this point because I've been doing them for so long. But again, I forget what I didn't know when I first started out. And you can see this immediately with when you're teaching somebody to program, and they're doing things like pressing space several times instead of tab a couple times.
Yeah. I was teaching at a law firm. I was like basically to teach them all to use, the software that they were practiced in. But one of the main things I ended up doing is doing like classes on Word, actually, because they all used it and all their documentation was in Word.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times it was like, okay, let's do some of the things you're just talking about. Like, yes, you can click once to put your cursor in, but if you double click on a word, it selects the whole word. Or if you triple click, it'll select the entire line. And most people were like, what? They haven't ever seen that. And then the things that you're talking about, like the combinations of shift and, control and arrows and, selecting entire lines, or, stuff like that are such fundamental things that really can, especially if, this is a person who is working with text all day.
Yeah.
And you maybe just sped them up drastically, with lots of little things like that. And I think those things being unlocked early are such great things for programmers to know.
Yeah, and we never sit down and teach anyone these things usually. Even when we're like, here's how to learn how to use a computer, it's usually about how to browse the web and check email.
Right.
But I think Cory Doctorow wrote an article in Wired, maybe like 20 years ago, where he said, he was talking about a study where they found out that about 95% of people don't know about Control F. like that you can just press Control F and then it'll open up a little dialog to where you can find text, like enter text that you want to find. And just, something that seems really basic, but at the same time, most people don't know about it. If they need to find a word or a name or something in a web page or in a document, they just manually scroll through and just scan with their eyes. And so there are people who, they would show like, hey, let me show you this thing, Control F. And they would say, oh my God, you've saved me years of my life from this one little thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Exactly. And then you can like tell it how you want to replace things. And yeah, these little things, like, again, kind of the introduction to the magic.
Yeah. So this introduction, I try to fit in a lot of these things, just, about like, here's how to copy paste, here's how to type, here's how to use, write the code in the book, and here's how to use the debugger. But still, the introduction isn't that long. I wanted to keep it short. But I sort of realized like, wow, this could probably be half the book if I wanted it to be. But the rest of the book then is just sort of, you don't have to read it front to back. You can just sort of flip through it and then see the projects that you find interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk about a few of the projects, but I want to mention one other thing that you included that I think's really kind of neat, which is the online diff tool that you added.
Yes. Yeah. So this is another thing. So the diff tool is often used for submitting patches or just showing changes between two versions of sort of the same bit of text. This really helped me out because people would email me saying like, hey, my program doesn't work.
Right.
And for my earlier books, and I realized I could cut down on a lot of those emails if I just had some sort of like online diff tool where they can copy and paste their code into my website and then click a button and it'll immediately show all the lines of code that are different from the code that's in the book. And this was really helpful. It doesn't have to be completely perfect. Like some white space can be off and it's fine. Or like they didn't type the comments.
I was wondering about the extra lines or something.
Yeah, but it would also point out like, hey, you typed a comma here when you wanted to put a period. Something that, you could look at the error message, but when you're a beginner, the error messages don't really make a lot of sense. And so you tend to ignore them. But like minor little things like that could just really, mostly save time and emails being sent to me, fixing people's code.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, that's another idea that I learned when teaching people how to program is, all these minor mistakes where once you have years of experience, they don't really faze you at all because you're sort of used to it. It's like, oh yeah, this error message just comes up. Let's try this. Or even, now is the time to turn it off and turn it back on again to magically fix it.
Yeah. So what were some of the projects that you were most eager to share?
Okay. So I'm looking through a lot of these and I realized that I according to the Git repo that I started, I think I first started making these in 2018.
Okay.
I wanted to create a bunch of small games that only used print and input and didn't have graphics, but they were still fun.
Yeah, like 2048 is like a great one.
Yeah, exactly. That's that tile sliding game where you try to combine powers of two, the lucky programmer numbers. And so I realized, hey, that's something that doesn't, it has graphics, but at the same time, you can recreate that with ASCII art, just using the lines and dashes, those text characters to draw out the boxes and things. So 2048 is on there. I just have like some pretty classic programs like Guess the Number or Rock, Paper, Scissors. These are usually programs that that feature in a lot of beginner tutorials.
Yeah.
And then I also try to have like a slight twist on them. Like I have Rock, Paper, Scissors as Project 59. And then Project 60 is Rock, Paper, Scissors, except you always win. Which is a slightly simpler program, really. But it looks the exact same, except the player is always winning. And the idea is like, just hand this off to your friends and show them this and see how long it takes for them to figure out that they can't possibly lose at this game. Like 99 Bottles is another program that's really common in a lot of beginner tutorials because it has, you get an introduction to loops and you just have it print out the lyrics to the song 99 Bottles of Beer on the Wall. So that's Project 50. And then Project 51 is an alternate version of that where you start introducing slight changes and deformities to the text. Like it'll replace a character with a blank, or it'll double a character, or it'll transpose two characters each time it prints out the stanza. So as the song continues to print out more and more, it starts looking more and more like you just got progressively more drunker as you were singing it. But yeah, there's a lot of board games that I have. Mancala is one. I had a checkers program that was going to get into this book, but I had to cut down on the content for that. There's some science and math programs. I have a periodic table of the elements, and also
Nice.
something that generates the multiplication table, something that can find factors or prime numbers, or do the Collatz sequence, which is also known as the 3x plus 1 problem. It's often called the simplest impossible problem in mathematics. That's in there. And then I have a lot of different visualizations. A lot of these visualizations sort of just take advantage of the fact that as you print more and more lines of text to the screen, the screen will start scrolling that text up. And so I started making these small little like animations, or like those old screensavers that all scroll upwards. So I have one that just shows sort of like a winding river. I call it Deep Cave because when I first made it, I thought like, oh, it's like a cave going deeper and deeper into the earth. And then only after the book was published, I was like, it would have been a lot better if I just called that a river. But something that...
Yeah, I like the DVD logo.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's one where that also kind of dates me, I feel like. But it'll have like the little DVD text that just bounces around diagonally around the screen. And then it'll also keep count of how many times it hits the corner exactly. But there's a visualization of DNA, just the double helix that just repeats. And then also I have the matrix screensaver where, instead of just like the green numbers and kanji characters scrolling down, it just has ones and zeros. But of course, they're also scrolling up. But it's a very similar effect. And so that sort of describes a lot of these programs. It's like, oh, hey, it's like this thing, except much, much simpler.
Yeah, I think they're great jumping off points too for people to, I don't know, it kind of brings me to this idea of like the idea of finishing things.
Yes.
Small things.
Yes.
And what that promotes in developers, I think that's a huge deal because, I'm definitely one of those people that I start a lot of things. So I like this idea of like, let's finish some things together, some small things. And like, what are your thoughts on that?
That was one of the big motivations for me working on these, is because, I would have these projects that are like, okay, I can have this done in like 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
And it turns out actually that was wildly optimistic. And it was this project that wasn't really for other people. It was just something that I was working on. And so I started falling back on these tiny games, and I realized this is a lot of fun because I'm actually finishing things. They're incredibly simple. It's, it's something I can finish and I can even show it to somebody else. Yeah, I keep telling people, like, whenever you have an idea for a programming project that you want to work on, create a list of what features you want it to have, and then try to cut that list down as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then also come up with a list of features that your program definitely won't have, because at some point, like 2 months into it, you're like, hey, it would be really cool if it could also send email notifications. And it turns out like, no, don't. We specifically do not want to have email notifications on this thing, because it's so much more frustrating to have, a dozen half-finished projects than just like 2 or 3 finished projects. Something that gives you that sense of accomplishment. Yeah, which is sort of the entire reason, that we learn to program, isn't so that we can have half-finished software everywhere.
Right.
You wouldn't think it,
exactly. But it definitely makes sense. Yeah. So I have a couple kind of like just general meta questions about the book, but more about like, what are areas of the language that, like Python, that you see total beginners struggle with that you think maybe this helps with?
Mostly is just the sort of blank editor fear that people have,
Okay.
where they have this idea in their head of a program they want to create, but then they really just don't know how to start. They know all about loops and variables and things like that, but when it comes to actually, like how do you sit down and create something, they have no idea, and they also have all this sort of half-remembered pieces of bad advice, and so they'll think like, well, first I need to, create like 5 different source code files, and this will have these functions, and this will have this other things, and they don't realize like actually it's fine if you just throw it all together. You can get it working first and then get it working well after that, because a lot of people are also just sort of worried about like, am I programming the right way? Like, am I writing code the way that professional software developers write code?
Right.
And the answer to that is, well, no, because there's no consensus whatsoever from all the different jobs and companies I've worked at. Everybody's sort of creating their own system that makes sense to them. And then all of their coworkers who get hired later on have to deal with that afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just really wanted to have this like, here are little programs, and they're not code snippets like in a lot of books where.
No, they do stuff,
Yeah.
which is cool. Yeah.
Yeah. The biggest complaint I have about a lot of programming textbooks is that you can't copy and paste the code as it appears on the page into your computer and then run it. Usually they'll just, for brevity, they'll cut out all of the like import statements or the includes, or there's some obvious setup that you have to do beforehand, but they're just trying to show you some algorithm or some function like that. But, that's it. It looks like code, but it's not really code because you can't actually run it. Whereas with these, you can actually run the program, and you can run them under a debugger, so you can see how they work one line at a time. And it just adds so much more if you can have real programs that people can play around with.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
I think probably my favorite game or my favorite program in this entire one is the snail race program.
Oh, okay.
It has ASCII art snails, and I draw them by using the @ symbol for the shell and then a V for the 2 eye stalks next to it. And it's not even really a game. You just enter how many snails you want to race, and then you give them names. And then you just watch. You don't even do anything. You just watch them as they slowly move from the left edge of the screen to the right edge of the screen. It's completely random. But at the same time, it is exciting when the snail that you've named after yourself wins the race. But
yeah, we have a project in like the end of a basic course on the turtle program where it's like a turtle race. And it's kind of a similar thing where you draw a really rudimentary thing. But that, I mean, I've seen those games, all over the place. The same kind of idea, watch the horses move or watch the marbles go. And it's nice to see that can be implemented with just, some text and make it go.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a lot of fun just taking these ideas and seeing how much can I cut the code down to, while still having, something that's fun to run, and also something that's, well documented. Like, I'm not trying to play code golf and cram everything into like 3 lines of code or anything like that. But, I was really surprised. And a lot of this is just the benefit of, 20 more years of game design that has come out, or, a lot of these like basic programming books or QBasic programming books from the 90s and 80s and 70s. One thing I noticed about a lot of those projects is they have a lot of bugs in them that just weren't taken out. And even the ones that don't, they're not really fun. So I try to make little programs where, it's, you can play around with it. It'll be like a little toy or just a small animation to watch or something like that. But it actually does something. It's like, oh, that's neat. And then even if you forget about it 10 minutes later, it was still like mildly amusing and gives you that sense of accomplishment when you make it.
Right. And you're learning, structures and practicing all these kinds of different things inside there, and, learning the meat and potatoes of Python programming. Meanwhile, you're actually completing things, that you can look at later and understand how they're working, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. I wanted to keep the code as simple as possible because I know some programmers will look at this book and say like, well, this code is like, you could have written it this way, using, classes or other sophisticated techniques. And a lot of times I'm just like, well, no, I just kind of wanted to make these short. And even if they don't follow best programming practices necessarily, they're easier to understand for beginners, which was the whole point that I was going for.
Yeah, definitely. So I have these general questions that I ask everybody, but actually I have one I wanted to add in this particular case. And it's, what is something you wish you were shown as a beginner in Python?
For Python, I think I would say for Python, I really wish I found out about the dir and help functions.
Yeah.
Because I think Python was sort of the first time where I was programming in a language that had an interactive shell, and you could just sort of play around with things. The dir function, it's a built-in Python function, and you can call it and pass it an object or a function, and it will show you the docstring for it. And so you can just easily access that's the help function, which obviously shows you the help for it. Dir you can pass it an object, and it'll show you all of the methods and attributes of that object. And so a lot of times when I'm just I want to explore some program and I want to say like, hey, what is this thing? It'll give me just, list these names. And that's not really helpful by itself, but it basically tells you, oh, this is the stuff that you should Google. Or like, hey, this thing looks interesting, look up more about it. And I feel like that's really helped me just figure out like, what are the next steps after I'm using something? Because I guess I could always sit down with reference materials and just read through it from A to Z. But at the same time, I kind of feel like, well, nobody really does that. If you're sort of just, working on like your snail race program and you want to like think like, hey, how can I make it do this other thing? And so you start taking a look at, you just sort of stumble your way through and picking up new bits of knowledge along the way.
Yeah, it's kind of one of these additional tools like we've mentioned a lot so far, like, the idea of the debugger and working inside the REPL, but like typing help and, and dir can really let you do almost half of the work before you have to go dive out into find the documentation. It's like half the time it's like, I can't remember what this thing's called or whatever. And there's these nice alternative REPLs I sometimes will use that do some of that work for you sometimes, where you can just hit like dot and it'll show you the method names and
right for like the autocomplete. Yeah.
What's something you're excited about currently in the world of Python? And it could be an event or book or project.
I am really excited about PyCon 2022. Knocking on wood there.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, it was all virtual this year and last year. And in 2019 was sort of like the first time since going to PyCon that I skipped going to PyCon, because I was going on a trek through the Himalayas, which sounds more exciting than it really was. But it was like a really great trip. I mean, it was worth missing PyCon for. Had I known that there would be a large global pandemic and PyCon would effectively not be the same like in-person meetup for the next 2 years, maybe I would have put the Himalayas off for a while. But yeah, so at this point, it's sort of been 3 years since I've seen a lot of people that I'm used to seeing at PyCon. And so, yeah, PyCon 2022, how long can this pandemic last, really? It's got to be over by next year, right?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
All the people that I know that are Python people are taking everything seriously.
Yeah,
so I feel like it's a unique community in that way, which is great.
Yeah, there's a wedding that I traveled to a few weeks ago for my best friend. And she originally was going to have it last year, but then of course canceled it. And now it was an outdoor wedding, and they had all these precautions and everything, but she was still incredibly nervous about it. And at the time, this was sort of before Delta was really coming into the news, and so it was like, but the wedding was absolutely incredible. And I realized it's been a year and a half since I've sat in a room with dozens of friends at the same time.
Yeah.
And so, that's sort of when I realized like, wow, I guess I usually get that feeling from PyCon. So So I'm really hoping things pick up and it'll be ready to go next year.
Yeah, I'm excited, and I hope I should be able to drive there from here, because I'd like to have a car and drive around Salt Lake and check out the area around it. But it will be so much fun to see everybody's faces.
Yeah.
It'll be cool. All right. What is something that you want to learn next? And again, it doesn't have to be Python in this case.
I mean, my only half-joking answer is time management or project management. Readers will send me emails saying like, "Hey, you should work on a data science book or a machine learning book," and those are really interesting, but I really don't know anything about it. And besides, I have probably like 3 or 4 major book and video course projects that I'm planning on doing at any given time.
Yeah,
it was kind of weird that the big book of small Python projects came out, a couple months ago, and it was only 6 months after my other book, Beyond the Basic Stuff with Python, came out. And I didn't write a book in 6 months. I was sort of working on both of these at the same time. Yeah, I always have a lot of plates spinning at the same time. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to getting a lot of those projects done.
Have you found tools that would help you in your time management? The things that you've thought about, or is it
a few?
More an internal journey?
Yeah, it's more just like random spreadsheets that I keep of myself. But I will say, I'm sure there's other websites like it, but there is one website called focusmate.com.
Okay.
And it basically sets you up with a 50-minute session with just some random stranger for a like a video conference, and then you both just silently work on something. And you have that pressure of like going to the gym with a friend, where it actually makes sure you go to the gym, because if you have this scheduled, you have to sit down and at least ostensibly work on your project for the next 50 minutes. And I found that that's really helped me, especially during the pandemic when I really couldn't go outside or go to cafes anymore. It gives me an excuse of like, okay, I have to roll out of bed and be up and, at least have the top half of myself presentable to another person at such and such a clock. Focusmate.com, I think it was like $4 or $5 a month. So it's sort of really helps keep me on task and hopefully.
I think you mentioned this last time we talked about it, I think. But this was a good reminder. I'm like, that thing.
Yeah, I'm still...
It's like 3 free sessions a week to try it out. So
yeah, I really should have them pay me to promote them. But I guess they don't, because I do it for free. But it's a great service. I really like it. And hopefully after the pandemic will be wrapped up pretty soon, so I never have to use it ever again.
Yeah. Do you have any like shout outs, final shout outs, and then also if you want to share like your social connection kind of information?
I didn't have any shout outs prepared, but I was about to say that this book, like all my books, is available under a Creative Commons license, so you can download it for free from inventwithpython.com. So if you're interested, you can actually just check out all the projects there. And then I also have links to the publisher's site and to Amazon and other booksellers. Yeah, inventwithpython.com. It's the big book of small Python projects.
Sweet. And then do you have a preferred way that people can connect with you?
Yeah, probably the best way is either through email or Twitter, although I'm always behind on those. So I'm al@inventwithpython.com. And then on Twitter, I'm just my name, Al Sweigart, which everyone, as of about 3 or 4 years ago, keeps reading that as AI Sweigart. Just because fonts are hard.
You're a bot. Yeah. Cool. Thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate you sharing the book, and it was fun to talk again.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Yeah, I hope you stay safe and take care.
Yeah, you too. I really want to see you at PyCon this year.
Yes.
Coming up.
Yeah, hope to see you at PyCon.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Don't forget, you can try out Rev AI with your first 5 hours for free at rev.ai. That's rev.ai. I want to thank Al Sweigart for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.